Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the EpiMed conference call. I'm pleased to present Joe Ferrara of Boston Healthcare. For the first part of this call, let me remind you that all participants will remain in listen-only mode, and there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Joe, please begin.
Thank you. Just by way of introduction, my name is Joe Ferrara. I lead the global consulting team at Boston Healthcare, and today I'm going to review the dynamics of global market access for companion diagnostics. Specifically, I'm not going to cover just Europe today. I will cover multiple territories globally, and really I'm going to be focused on the dynamics that need to be considered in both commercial strategy and upstream in partnering. The talk will take about 40 minutes, and then we can go to Q&A. So today I'm going to cover one of the key challenges, which is the disconnect between diagnostics and therapeutics on so many levels with regard to market access. I'll highlight some of those, and then value capture approaches in companion diagnostics and codependent drugs. And finally, I'll wrap up with implications for innovators. This talk's really centered on codependent test-drug combinations. We'll highlight some of the dynamics that may be similar to, let's say, high-value standalone diagnostics, but really this presentation is focused on codependent technologies. I'm going to start with the very different regulatory development and commercialization paradigms in pharma versus the diagnostics industry. So not just companions, but diagnostics broadly, pharma broadly. I think it really requires the merging of two very different approaches in everything from investment, evidence development, and commercialization approaches. I want to highlight some of these. I think on the pharmaceutical side, it's well known that pharma development is a long-term process. It's expensive, and FDA and other agencies will grant approval through rigorous evidence development. Compare that to the diagnostics on the development side. These are very quick development cycles for diagnostics products, typically 2 to 3 years, $7 to $10 million in investment, and really typically an expeditious regulatory clearance, CE mark or 510K in the U.S. And I think this takes us up to approval and clearance, but really where even broader differences occur that maybe are less considered in CDX pharma partnerships are the differences in the commercialization approaches. On the pharma side, pharmaceutical companies obviously distribute and sell drugs globally, typically demanding immediate market access or developing strategies to create the environment for immediate market access and deploying substantial market access resources, health economics tools, and so on. Compared to the diagnostics industry, it's quite different. Diagnostics commercialization is focused on broad platform use. So typically IVD innovators are focused on identifying an increasing number of kits or tests that could be deployed on the installed base of platforms. And often around that is minimal market access support. Diagnostics industry is focused on the laboratory as the customer typically, perhaps less so the physician, and only occasionally the payer. Most of the reimbursement in the diagnostics world is through an iterative process, and I'll get into this a little bit, but there's typically a lag. So unlike the drug world where we may expect immediate formulary access at launch or price negotiation and a rigorous HTA process, diagnostics is typically an iterative review process and I'll get to where that review occurs and how it differs from the drug industry. But as you can see, these are two very different approaches to commercialization of technologies. Regulatory pathway, certainly investment, and evidence development. And I think these yield very different expectations for development and market access for companion diagnostics. I think it also really points to some of the challenges that we've seen in developing partnerships in this space and identifying these dynamics as key components of partnerships. Now I'm going to touch on this focus on commercialization activities in a little more detail. When we look across the ecosystem in pharmacodiagnostics, you're seeing that these offerings are being deployed by a range of players with varied capabilities in development and commercialization. Most of the emphasis to date in partnerships between companion diagnostics and or diagnostics innovators and pharma has been on the development side, not surprisingly. And we've seen a few examples of launch, and I'll get into that. But you can see here basically the origins of these different innovators and where they're coming from. So it could be a platform innovator who's developing a companion test based on certain platform capabilities. Could be in vivo, in vitro, informatics based. Certainly there's the content, who owns the content, the specific content of the marker, and then of course novel assay discovery. And then the development phase, so turning a biomarker into a clinic-ready assay that can be driven through a regulatory approval and clearance process. And there are other players involved. There are, of course, IVD innovators, CROs, and biobanking functions to support all of these activities. What I really want to highlight is these activities on the right, these key commercialization activities. One is the companion diagnostic lab service or distribution model. I think this is something that may be overlooked in the development stage, yet becomes critical to widespread market access to test and drug. And then finally, commercial execution, the launch of the companion test. Who's going to be responsible for providing test pull-through, executing the testing distribution strategy, basically ensuring that a test result gets to a physician to enable a prescription of the appropriate therapy. And then finally, optimizing market access for the test. So what I want to do today is go through, parse these commercialization activities a bit, talk about who may be responsible for assuming these responsibilities in a partnership, and then the dynamics themselves. I want to highlight why understanding the commercialization parameters and market access pathways for companion diagnostics is important for pharmaceutical innovators. I think it may seem obvious, but I want to highlight some of the dynamics that we've seen that have really limited access to the pharmaceutical. The first one is that a test platform may be selected for use in the trial, simply may not be viable commercially in global markets, or it may be viable in only certain global markets. So post-launch, it is determined that only a limited number of labs globally have relevant testing capabilities, such as FISH, an alternative method, such as IHC or PCR, maybe have to develop post-launch during a critical post-launch phase in order to enable widespread test access. So that is definitely a challenge that we've seen, is sort of lack of consideration of the commercial implications of platform selection upstream. The second issue I'd like to highlight is that the regulatory approved assay may face competition from alternative methods. I'm sure you're familiar with laboratory developed tests, and laboratory developed tests are a fact in most global markets, in particular outside of the US. Sometimes lower quality, sometimes higher costs that can inhibit therapy access. And I think that this is something that would have to be managed by a pharmaceutical innovator, and we'll get into that. timing of funding for the drug and test can be misaligned, and the test may not be reimbursed, necessitating a pharmaceutical company funding model for testing. I'd have to say, looking globally in the 35 or so markets that we've assessed for companion diagnostics pathways, most often the model is a pharmaceutical company funding model for testing. But, of course, this poses challenges. It means that both products may not reach patients effectively, can have major implications, of course, on revenue. And the pharma sponsor needs to know what that network of labs that they would need to work with to support testing and make sure the test is available for physicians and patients. I think that overall the theme here is that the pharma innovator cannot assume that a companion diagnostic designed for regulatory approval will meet commercial needs, and it may take a substantial role in ensuring that a viable and quality assay is available to physicians and patients. And I think that it goes back to what I was discussing earlier, building these commercial parameters upstream in the partnership structure from the beginning to contemplate these issues, and even partner selection. So I want to give an example of another difference between tests and drugs, not particularly companion tests and drugs, but just generally speaking on policy development and access controls. We can see very different payer approaches to control for market access for these technologies. On the left, we see the drug world. Drugs are a highly visible cost proportion of every plan's total care costs in the U.S. Almost all drugs are reviewed by a P&T committee as a gateway to access, typically paid from a pharmacy or medical benefit, but the evidence requirement is uniformly high, derived from the evidence for the clinical trial, and any additional evidence that a payer may need to support market access could be health economic information, could be comparative data, and so on. I think we're all familiar with some of the access controls on the drug side, patient co-pays or some sort of co-insurance or cost sharing, which basically allow payers to deliver tighter control over which drugs get paid, which and how much the plan spends on these drugs. The access implications, it's evidence intensive, but essentially once it's gone through the process, a drug can expect widespread access at launch. The diagnostics world is a very different story. Diagnostics payers generally view as sort of often low cost compared to other technologies, other costs, but now rising and becoming more visible, certainly in the U.S. Policy review, it's rare that tests are reviewed for explicit policy, coverage policy. Typically these are paid from the medical benefit, often from a clinical lab fee schedule or some sort of tariff or fee schedule. Evidence requirements are quite variable. I would say that there are not substantial evidence standards for clinical diagnostics that are routinely demanded by payers. What kinds of access controls do we see? Fee schedule arrangements, as I mentioned, between payers and reference labs that are negotiated, and then some emerging control paradigms as payers can now recognize certain molecular tests given a refined CPT coding system. I think this is the U.S. example, but I think some of these implications are widespread, and that is that access to the test evolves through an iterative claims or iterative process of a physician ordering, laboratory performing, and submitting a claim to be paid, or budget-based funding of a test. Note that a unique approach for companion diagnostics has not been widely established in this paradigm, so I think there are some key exceptions, but by and large, companion diagnostic will face many of these similar access controls that general diagnostic tests face. The one key difference, of course, is clinical utility data that would be available for a companion test or a codependent test should be much more robust coming out of agency approval. I want to highlight some of the U.S. regulatory approval of these drug diagnostic combinations and just talk a little bit about label impact on commercial access policy. I think we've highlighted this earlier, approval timing and labeling can vary in some of the predicates that we look at here. So you can see a couple of examples of simultaneous approval but separate review, and then of course delayed review and revised label of the drug for a test that's developed and reviewed after the drug has been launched. You can see an unusual example here for Tisabri with an FDA-approved test that's a laboratory-developed test. It's an unusual example. And of course, very well known from 2011, Zelboraf with BRAF V600E and Xalkori, where we saw joint FDA approval of drug test combinations, and these were joint and expeditious reviews. These have been the exception historically. We probably will see more of it, but what we want to highlight here is that many of the examples we see in companions on the market today were uncoordinated launches of drug and test, in some cases with assays that are simply not FDA cleared. And labeling variety creates challenges for payers to develop policy approaches and funding approaches. I want to highlight some of the evolving landscape before I get into the commercial framework that I wanted to talk about. How will players position to shape the evolving companion diagnostic market landscape? And I think, we talk about the Herceptin example and BRAF and Xalkori and ALK, but today there really have been very few examples of these combinations, but we know that they're coming, each with their own sets of correlated biomarker targets. And increasingly, these biomarkers are multi-biomarker panels that can be used, that can describe the use of different drugs, sometimes using even next-generation sequencing as the future, versus relying on a single gene and single drug. Evidence requirements, I think the clinical utility for companion diagnostics is largely developed during the drug trial, but the future we see perhaps a shift in the evidence of test value established independently by laboratories that create maybe a different business model. An independent test quality review made mandatory. Coverage, we talked about the benefit categories in the U.S. in particular not being well linked. I think this is a phenomenon that we see in many mature markets where the drug is paid out of one type of budget, the test another. I think the future, we're going to see preferential access given to products with a companion diagnostic component, and then, of course, increased focus on drug utilization management, requiring that testing be done as an explicit policy and non-CDX drugs disadvantaged. Excuse me. On the coding, this is largely a U.S. phenomenon, but I think historically payers in the U.S. have been not really had available to them the clarity they needed on which tests are being done as companion tests and why in the claims system, and now with the revised and refined coding system for all of its challenges, it has created a more granular claims information set for payers. And finally, payment. I think that it really aligns with this one test, one drug, a payment methodology that's based on this kind of fee-for-service model. I think is what we see largely today, but where it will likely evolve is more complex global or capitated arrangements. We could see things like pathway programs and oncology benefit managers getting involved, or entities responsible for population management, and laboratories joining forces to basically bring the test value and the drug value together along with care management as a total service offering, rather than line item reimbursement or funding of these technologies. Finally, I think it's important to note, and it is related to my last point, that we are seeing, particularly in mature healthcare markets, but in some key emerging markets as well, under global health reform, stakeholders are obviously seeking value through managing increased access, improved quality, and financial stability. What it really says to innovators is that innovators have to look to combine both the technologies and processes to deliver the clinical success, the economic success, and then the practice level success. And I really want to focus on these solution components in the middle, bringing together clinical and economic impact with an integration of training and education, connectivity and performance measurement to show the impact of that technology in care management, managing the distribution and logistics and patient experience and so on, rolling these together to create a strategic solution that addresses customer value perspectives. I think gone are the days when we'll be able to bring a drug to market and expect that a combination of payers and clinicians will figure out how to integrate into clinical practice and fund these technologies. I think that these stakeholders are expecting a much more complete solution. And customers will need the tools to effectively integrate technologies into clinical practice and demonstrate value to each other in this type of environment. So now I'd like to talk about optimizing access for the combinations. I think it's important to highlight business model approaches and addressing a complex mix of value perspectives. I think this is no different than the way we've historically looked at market access for drugs, devices, diagnostics, and so on. The difference here is that all the stakeholders in codependent technologies are after one thing, which is optimizing access to appropriate therapy that improves outcomes. So you can see some of those evidence demands as a highlight here. Certainly on the regulatory side, we're looking for evidence of safety and efficacy, but what does that label look like? The payers, evidence to support payment or funding, but what kind of restrictions could the drug or test encounter? I think laboratory dynamics are important. What kind of risk will a laboratory be taking? Will it make the test available? Will a lab make the test available? Will they be paid adequately to make that test available? Of course, health technology assessment bodies, they have adequate evidence for appraisal, but also are these processes aligned? Only in a few key markets are the drug and diagnostic HTA processes aligned. What we're seeing in some markets is basically work needs to be done to bring these processes into alignment. And then, of course, patients concerned about cost sharing and the impact of these potentially expensive technologies on their wallets. So the business model, or basically how risk is apportioned amongst these stakeholders, has to address the value perspectives while delivering ROI to the innovators here, minimizing market access risk. So what I'd like to get to now is a way of assessing that risk, and it's a strategic framework that I'm going to introduce. So to build an effective CDX-RX business model, I think there's some key commercialization factors that have to be addressed. I'm going to highlight each of these in turn, going from evidence and quality, distribution and logistics, policy and coverage, payment and financial risk, coding, largely a U.S. phenomenon, and then finally the infrastructure capabilities needed to execute. I think these factors need to be addressed in parallel with typical upstream issues embedded in product development, manufacturing, and so on. They also have to be addressed globally to align with drug launch priorities and targeted medicines being launched in multiple and many markets simultaneously. I should also stress that these elements should be examined at the business development stage and should influence both partner selection and deal structure in the IVD and pharma partnership model. I'm going to start off with evidence and quality, as I said. Balancing quality and market access. I think this is a key issue. I would say that the bias from most of the launches we've seen to date have been favoring access, which is widespread patient and lab availability, simultaneous drug and test access, which can be a challenge, but certainly has been a goal, and then payment adequacy for the provider. But on the quality side, we see some challenges. And I think that what we're going to see, and I think it will be driven by multiple stakeholders here, not just pharma and IVD, innovators, but really seeking a balance of quality and access. So we minimize lab-to-lab variability in testing, that there is robust evidence standards to support quality, and then at the same time allowing for ongoing test innovation. We know that, having looked at these issues globally, stakeholders are seeking transparency and predictability, driving quality, access, and innovation. Can we develop quality standards, which is a gap, and who should do it? Can payment incentivize quality in companion diagnostics? That's a question. I want to highlight the quality challenges. Here's an example. I think there are even better examples than KRAS, but KRAS is currently performed using a range of approaches with substantial lab-to-lab variability, real-time approaches, pyrosequencing, direct sequencing, and so on, different limits of detection, different advantages, and so on. I go back to this question, who will take the lead in deploying these standards, and in a vacuum, how involved should pharma and diagnostics players be in taking the lead in developing these standards, particularly if lab distribution is broad? I'm going to touch on distribution and logistics. I think it's another key factor that needs to be analyzed, both upstream and, of course, for commercial success. Are we anticipating a centralized model, decentralized, some sort of hybrid model? Obviously, balancing quality concerns with regulatory requirements by geography. And are we looking for something done where AMCs and specialty labs are really the focus, which is where most of the combinations or companion diagnostics are offered today. But we see some applications in the pipeline where we may see much broader networks where some of these drug technologies are focused on large patient populations. Also, as a test matures, of course, it may move down this list to become more widely available. I think this issue and these dynamics need to be understood by geography. Here's some examples on distribution and logistics issues. Where is testing done for complex molecular testing? Will that be the site or sites for CDX testing? And I give some examples here from some emerging markets where we see just two key centers to highly decentralized models in countries like Brazil and the U.S., and maybe network models in countries like France and so on. These issues and these dynamics need to be well understood and mapped essentially to align with drug launch priorities. I touched on this a little bit earlier, which is this difference between drug and test on differences in access and control. There's a difference I want to highlight on health technology assessment and policy development. That is that, in some of the key markets we highlight here, in Japan, France, and so on, for cancer drugs, you have a highly national process, highly centralized process for HTA review for the drug component. But that changes for the test in many cases. Cancer tests actually are largely reviewed at the local level, may be paid out of a hospital budget in many markets. There are some budgets dedicated to innovative testing offerings in certain key markets and so on. But these differences are substantial, and I think from a commercial perspective, ensuring that we have the infrastructure to address these key differences is critical to ensure test access and thus drug access. There's some more examples of some of the delays that we've seen schematically. Timing of test coverage review has historically hindered drug access. I think this is well documented, and the joint simultaneous review for policy is where we want to go. And of course, it's more likely if the test is indicated in the drug label as required. But the most common predicate is actually the one in the middle here, where the drug is reviewed, the test review does not occur too much further downstream. There are a couple of key exceptions where you have a more coordinated HTA review, like NICE in the UK, or maybe through the funding model in France, through INCA and so on. But in many markets, the most common predicate is this middle one with a delayed review of the test. You may get implicit coverage of tests if the laboratories are using existing payment channels or coding, but how this gap is handled from a financing perspective is critical. I think from both a test innovator and a drug innovator, the question I think that needs to be asked, okay, if I'm a pharmaceutical and funding the test, fine, but for how long and in which countries? And from an IVD innovator's perspective, I think a key question will be, where should I focus my energies in securing reimbursement as a long-term way of funding testing, and where will that simply not take place? Of course, we have seen some companion tests, not necessarily codependent tests, but some codependent tests where they have independent prognostic value, and the tests can be available and secure prior to launch, but this is very rare. But clearly, this delayed review model can result in inconsistent access to drug and test. Payment and financial risk. I want to introduce 4 basic models for funding of companion diagnostics. I have them in the middle here. Which stakeholders must take financial risk for testing to optimize drug access, and what are those likely payment outcomes? Do they align with the test value perception? Do they align with payment adequacy needs for a lab provider? Does coding support the mechanics of routine payment? Those funding models that I wanted to highlight are these 4. Innovator direct, which is I think what we most often think of when pharma funding model, where a laboratory is funded directly from a pharmaceutical company. An indirect model also exists where perhaps a grant is created or a funding budget is created that indirectly funds testing. Of course, explicit payer funding is where there is an explicit policy to cover testing and pay for it. And then implicit payer funding, we would consider a fee schedule kind of approach where there's not an explicit policy, but funding is available through a fee schedule model. Is diagnostic payment cost-based or value-based? Currently marketed examples have several models, but these are predominantly cost-based. Very rarely have companion tests been value-based reimbursed. But I think it is indicative that these models need to be understood. And as an IVD innovator, I would certainly want to understand both the cost-based reimbursed approach and a value basis of reimbursement to understand my test's value in the marketplace in structuring my relationship with a pharma partner. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but you can see the complexity here of countries deploying a mix of budget-based systems, non-specific coding and systems, and then analyte-specific payment systems. You'll note that the U.S. here is in both the analyte-specific coding system, and then there's of course still a non-specific fee schedule-based system in the U.S. So both models are operative for companion tests in the U.S. today. I'm going to talk a little bit about payment assignment. I'm going to give the U.S. example here. I think some of this is related to what we see globally also. I think payers generally have a range of approaches for valuing companion tests or tests in general. I want to highlight those 4 here because I think it's important for both the pharma and IVD partner to understand these methodologies of valuing testing. The first is the content cost-based. So, it's based on basically similar content. A new cardiovascular test is compared to another cardiovascular test, and payment is assigned accordingly based on that content predicate or clinical area predicate. Certainly a methodology cost basis reimbursement where, the methodologies are similar, laboratory processes and procedures and these can be rolled together to create a kind of payment that is cost-based, but built on a kind of micro-costing as a tool to build up the true cost of a test plus an adequate margin for the laboratory provider. Patient volume and actuarial dynamics are important, particularly in the U.S., and this is because payers are competitive. There could be models for diagnostics in general where payers will attempt to pass on to their employer customers the cost of bringing a new test into coverage, which is different than health economics on the right, which is looking at test costs in the context of offset spending. These are very different dynamics in the U.S. In the U.S., we've seen, and in some markets actually, not only the U.S., payment may be achieved through some sort of miscellaneous coding approach, but it will be inconsistent for the laboratory. Note that codependent or FDA-approved tests do not have unique payment assignment processes. There is one key exception that I will highlight, but that is very rare. So I think a question for innovators here is, how can we develop processes that meet the demands of codependent technologies, and are they any different than other tests? Should they be any different? I think one of the key issues to address here is, again, the simultaneity of access that is so critical for these combinations. So payment assignment that's tied to a simultaneous launch seems to be in order, and possibly payment assignment tied to quality standards is also an issue to be addressed. I told you that I would cover a specific example of differentiated payment for an FDA-approved or agency-approved test. Here's an example again for KRAS in the U.S. I just want to highlight the evolution here of payment for KRAS testing in the U.S. Here you can see a number of laboratories at the top here that have been performing KRAS tests, again using different methodologies that I highlighted earlier in the quality slide, all with different payment amounts that they were able to secure through Medicare, the largest single payer in the U.S. Then in 2013, you saw new gene-specific codes available for use. So a new KRAS code was created and available January 1 of 2013. Here you can see the payment assignment processes by two key carriers in the U.S. So carriers assigned payment based on some of these predicates, and you can see them around $225 to $235 for KRAS tests. But when it was all said and done, Medicare aggregated this information and created a payment rate, a national limitation amount for KRAS testing of $197 on the clinical lab fee schedule for 2014. Highlights a couple of things here. One is, when we have test-specific coding, it makes it much easier for payers to re-examine payment for tests, of course. I think also there's a clear trend here in the erosion of payment for testing, and moving from a $300 level to a $197 level is a substantial hit for laboratories, and this is definitely being felt and has some consequential results for the laboratory industry in the U.S. I do want to highlight, and I mentioned this earlier, that using a separate coding system, one Medicare carrier in the U.S. can distinguish between FDA-approved versions of tests and LDT versions, and can assign differentiated payment for FDA-approved tests. I think this is something that could be considered globally as desirable, and that is not necessarily FDA-approved versus LDT, but differentiated payment when testing is able to meet certain quality standards. Finally, infrastructure and capabilities. What do the processes look like? Who are the people? What kind of content do they need? What resources do they need to optimize execution in this space? There are a couple of factors that would influence this. One is the scale of the testing application itself. I think the complexity of testing and sample logistics is another key factor that we've seen will influence the type of infrastructure that needs to be built. And geographies and launch sequence alignment, of course, who's going to be responsible for payer and provider engagement, and then what kind of quality support initiatives would be needed. I think this is a factor that needs to be assessed, I think, quite early on, and the more that's understood about these dynamics by both the drug innovator and test innovator or test developer, I think the better able both parties will be to execute in this space. Building these infrastructure demands upstream into partnership structure, and then ensuring that they meet the needs of the commercial dynamics. I'm going to end the discussion with some key implications and some questions, and then I'll turn it over to you for any questions you have. I think the question for both the pharma and IVD innovators today is, do we have the infrastructure to achieve routine access for the test at a desired quality standard, and can we do it globally? What do we need to build? How long will it take? What will it cost? These are key parameters that need to be better understood. I mentioned this earlier, it's really been a theme. How can we best build commercial parameters into our partnerships to optimize value for both parties and optimize energy and focus for both parties? For the CDX developer or IVD innovators, how can we best convince a therapeutic partner that we can minimize hurdles to drug access? And then I think a question that is always there is, how can we support an investment in the infrastructure needed to enable this commercialization, especially if testing volumes may be so low in the CDX space? Are we capturing enough value in the deal to build this infrastructure out, or will the pharma partner be building this infrastructure to enable commercialization? For pharmaceutical companies, how can we enable our diagnostics partner to achieve routine optimal access for the test, or not the partner, the test itself? Which elements of the pathway do we take on ourselves? And I think we've seen quite a range of models here. I think it's going to be clinical area dependent, specialty dependent, and some of those issues I highlighted earlier around the infrastructure in terms of scale of application, so on. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to ask a question, please dial 01 on your telephone keypad and you will enter a queue. When you are announced, please ask your question. So once again, please dial 01 now. And the first question comes from Patrick Corman from Myriad Genetics. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Joseph. Thanks for this presentation. Very interesting one and quite comprehensive. My question will be related to what you shown on this slide deck. On my point of view, was more explaining what was really happening in the US. And my question will be, how do you foresee the situation and the evolution of these both, let's say, parallel approval for companion diagnostic and drugs in Europe?
Yeah, I think you're quite familiar with some of the initiatives underway, and I'd mentioned I'm going to speak not from a regulatory perspective necessarily, but from a, let's say, health technology assessment and appraisal. I think in Europe you do see, particularly in France and the UK, I think fairly structured processes for review of drug and test simultaneously for coverage and access. I think it's quite different in some other markets where you'll see local review of test versus national review of drug, or even regional review of drug versus hospital level or laboratory level review of the test access and pricing.
Yeah, so maybe to make my question a little bit more defined, I was more focusing on pricing and reimbursement, because at the end, what will matter is the companion diagnostic funded in a way or another, meaning reimbursed, and how to build this with pharma companies, because we can imagine that there will be some differences in objectives between the pharma and diagnostic companies.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, I mean, as I said earlier, I think a key question for the diagnostics player, you know, the development stage of the deal is most typically a fee-for-service model. How far that diagnostics partner goes in commercialization, and I think is a key factor in how much value they will be able to capture once the test is on the market. And I think it does come back to what is the availability of LDTs, and what is the pharma partner's attitude towards laboratory developed tests. I think an argument could be made that the IVD partner, if they do their homework, should be able to identify, you know, in which territories they will invest and expend energy to secure adequate reimbursement or basically drive access for the test. And in some markets, there just may be simply limitations for that, although one could argue there could be a fee-for-service model, again, in commercialization where a pharma partner would leave it to a diagnostics partner to secure test access, whether it is the IVD innovators kit or tests or the LDT. But I think this is less likely, and I think it's really the pharma company that will take the lead in this. I hope this gets at your question.
Yeah. No, it's okay. Are we alone on the line, or are there other people there? Because I can't see any other attendee.
I think there are other people.
Okay.
Other people can hear what you're saying, indeed.
Yes. I'm happy to take additional questions.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, once again, as a reminder, you need to dial 01 on your telephone keypad to ask a question. Thanks.
I will say if there are any follow-up questions, many of you know how to reach me. And certainly you can go to our website and get our contact information if there are other questions you'd rather address separately. I'll make myself available.
No questions coming through on the audio, but it's still possible to ask a question via audio by dialing 01 on your telephone keypad. Okay, we have another question from Patrick Coleman from Myriad Genetics. Please go ahead.
Yes, Joseph. So I was just wondering if we can have access to this very good presentation. Is it a way for you to send it by email, or is it available somewhere?
Yes. I'll send it to you by email, Patrick. Just send me an email and I'll reply with the presentation for you.
Okay, perfect.
Well, thank you all.
Okay, Joe, it seems that no more questions are coming through.
Okay, we can wrap it up then. Anything else you want to add, Ben, at this point, or should we end the call?
Nothing from my side, so if there's no more... There was just one comment from Nicolaus Wick, who didn't connect on the audio. He said he didn't realize he had to connect on the audio, but he thoroughly enjoyed reading the slides. So that's one message I can relay.
Thank you. Okay, very well. Thanks very much, everybody.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's conference call. Thank you all for attending.